Okay, everybody, this is Joseph P. Farrell. This is March 27th, 2014, with news and views from the Nefarium. And before I start, I want to thank everybody for sending me a lot of great articles over the past month or so. You've all been really great about sharing all these things. I want to thank those of you who make donations as well. It's truly appreciated. And work on the book continues. I'm hoping to have it done hopefully sometime next month. Keep your fingers crossed. All right. We have a lot of stuff to cover today in the aftermath of the Ukrainian situation. And I did want to talk about something else, but it seems that there's a lot going on in the world that has basically become fallout from the situation and the complete ineptitude and incompetence. I can't qualify it as anything else coming out of the West and in particular at Washington, D.C. Now, the incompetence, believe it or not, I am not fingering the Obama administration as much as I am fingering the neocon or neoconservative rogue element within the American national security, military, industrial, intelligence, finance, foreign policy complex. All right. Um, I really think that there's a struggle going on inside of the United States between that warmongering element and elements of the Obama administration, represented by the president, by Secretary of State Kerry, and so on. The fallout that I'm talking about is three stories, all of which concern Russia. And I'll link these stories for you. The first is a story that appeared in RT, and the headline is Russia to launch its payment system in months as disruption fears mount. And this story, it's important to note, comes after talks in Western governments, particularly the United States and Europe, and in Europe, particularly Germany, about imposing sanctions on Russia. Now, I have a blog coming up scheduled for next week where it appears that Chancellor Merkel has nixed the idea for the moment of Germany participating in any sanctions, which makes good sense because Germany, of course, gets a lot of its energy from Russia, not the Middle East, as does most of Europe. So this is the big problem. Sanctions aren't going to work. President Obama imposed a limited amount of sanctions, but the mere threat of imposing sanctions and the fact that certain Western banks, MasterCard and Visa, have withdrawn or imposed a sanction on certain Russian banks from using MasterCard and Visa. All right. Now, all that this has really done is it's pushed Russia to speed up its internal domestic electronic financial clearing network, free of any Western corporations like MasterCard, Visa, and so on from having inroads into Russia. Listen to this story from Russia Today. Quote, the move by international payment systems Visa and MasterCard to block their use in Russia has unnerved some Russian businesses. Meanwhile, Moscow says its own national payment system may become fully operative within months. Last week, MasterCard and Visa stopped servicing some Russian banks, which shows the Russian market remains the monopoly of international operators. And continuing later on, it's talking about the payment system PRO 100, launched as a pilot in 2010. The project Universal Electronic Card provides for settlements of government, municipal, and commercial services via internet and self-service machines. The card's electronic banking application is based on the payment system Universal Electronic Card, which has a PRO 100 logo. And the RT article, which I will link on the site, there's a picture of the Russian card, and then up here, of course, it's Universal Electronia Carta, all right? up in Russian, and then down here is the PRO logo. And you'll notice, interestingly enough, on this card, prominently displayed, is the Romanov family double-headed eagle with the scepter and the orb prominently displayed on that card. A little bit of a symbol of what is really going on. Now, before we get to the other two articles, what I'm going to suggest is that this is the first step that I'm predicting is going to be coming down the pike. In that, in order for the BRICS nations to have their own independent competing system of international financial clearing, which inevitably they must do, and I think when you hear the next two articles, you're going to hear how that possibility is now ratcheted up several notches, all right, in terms of the probability that this is coming down the pike, and it's probably coming down the pike faster than we think. But in order for this to occur, they're also going to have internal networks of clearing to make all this work. And Russia's taking the first step towards implementing something it's been discussing for some time. And what has driven the impetus and created the urgency in Russia to do this is the threat, is the talk of the imposition of sanctions, because Russia's energy export for the moment, and therefore the Russian economy, is very heavily dependent on European imports of Russian energy. So if there are sanctions, Europe loses, Russia loses. The only people that really gain economically is the Anglo-American financial elite. But in the long term, their policies have now pushed Russia yet one more step to implementing that independent financial clearing free of the West. And that's going to be a significant development. Now, there's two other stories that occurred at the same time within the last couple of weeks as this story announcing the Russian development of their domestic internal financial clearing. And the first is a story, both stories reported in Zero Hedge. But the first is a story entitled, quote, Petrodollar Alert, Putin Prepares to Announce a Holy Grail Gas Deal with China. And I want to read just a few paragraphs from this article because you'll get the idea. Quote, while Europe is furiously scrambling to find alternative sources of energy should Gazprom, that's the big huge Russian energy combine, pull the plug on natural gas exports to Germany and Europe, the imminent surge in Ukraine gas prices by 40% is probably the best indication of what the outcome would be. Russia is preparing the announcement of the Holy Grail energy deal with none other than China, a move which would send geopolitical shockwaves around the world and bind the two nations in a commodity-backed axis. One which, as some, especially on these pages, have suggested, would lay the groundwork for a new joint commodity-backed reserve currency that bypasses the dollar, something which Russia implied moments ago when its finance minister Sulianov said that Russia may refrain from foreign borrowing this year. Translated, that means they're planning to bypass Western purchases of Russian debt funded by Chinese purchases of U.S. treasuries and go straight to the source. Now, this deal, as you read in the article, the deal is based on a new plant, natural gas plant, that the Russians are building in the extreme eastern end of Siberia, and it will probably connect to China via a pipeline. Now, the punchline in this article is this, quote, a strong alliance would suit both countries as a counterbalance to the United States. An alliance that would merely be an extension of current trends in close bilateral relations, including not only infrastructure investment, but military supplies. Now, What this means is if they put into place that structure, they're also going to have to put into place some means of international financial clearing. Now, here's the catch. I've been arguing all along for quite some time against the apocalyptic imminent financial collapse models that most people out there are pushing or promoting or talking about. And I realize that puts me in a distinct and definite minority. But the reason why I've been arguing that way is that reserve currency status historically has always accrued to the preeminent naval power. So you look back at history, you see Venice, then Portugal, Spain, France, and of course Great Britain with the British Empire, and now the United States. But as the mechanisms of international financial clearing have changed so dramatically in the latter half of the 20th century, where clearing is now based on electronic transfer of signals, it now means that naval power is replaced by space power. So it's the control of space resources, satellites, and communications there that now denotes reserve currency status. So, what this deal with China portends is not only that those two countries are going to have to figure out some US free network of independent financial clearing, they're also going to have to beef up their space program. And of course, we've seen China doing this, and I suspect that this is part of the financial reason for them to do so. We're also going to see the same thing happen coming out of Russia. They are going to expand dramatically their space program if they're to have any hope of setting up a dollar free mechanism of international clearing based on a commodities backed currency. Eventually, I think, folks, and I can fairly reasonably predict, you'll find out in the blogs coming this week why. I think the long term trend is for Europe to integrate itself in that emerging Russia, China, India, Brazil, South Africa, the BRICS nations trading axis, in other words. I think the long term interest of Europe lies in that direction. So we're also going to see Europe joining in increasing bilateral space agreements with either Russia or China, or perhaps trilateral agreements with both. And it will be for the purposes of bypassing American power and influence in international clearing. So that's Russia and China. They're brokering the sweetheart gas energy deal, which means something else very significant. Russia is diversifying, so to speak, its export portfolio so that it is not nearly so dependent on European imports of its energy, and it's expanding its markets now rather dramatically with China. And that is a huge, just like Zero Hedge put it, that's a huge geopolitical shockwave. It's going to have repercussions for geopolitics in the Middle East. It's certainly going to have repercussions on the oil producing countries in that region because Russia is emerging as a major competitor to that region. And it has one crucial significant difference with that region. It is a unified political entity with a long history, a long culture. It is partly a European culture, it's partly an Asiatic culture, and most importantly, it's a thermonuclear power, of course. So now, as if that's not bad enough news for the ineptitude of the oligarchs in Washington, D.C., in the neocon driven agenda to encircle Russia and uh, defang it, so to speak, Russia is also seeking to negotiate a similar package of deals, commodities, and energy deals with India. All right, listen to this. Rosneft CEO Igor Sechin, this article is from Zero Hedge. Russia prepares mega deal with India after locking up China with Holy Grail gas deal. And again, Rosneft is one of these big Russian energy cartels, one of these big Russian corporations. And trust me, folks, Gazprom, as big as many of the European companies are, think of Bayer or BASF or Siemens, companies like that, as big as those companies are, Gazprom in Russia dwarfs them. Okay, so in other words, these are huge corporations and they're very powerful and they're very Russian. Okay, they are not the international mega corporations or conglomerates of the West. These are Russian mega corporations. They're Russian in their core. Rosneft CEO Igor Sechin, an ally of President Vladimir Putin, traveled to India on Sunday, part of a wider Asian trip to shore up ties with Eastern allies at a time when Moscow is being shunned by the West over its annexation of China. Rosneft has agreed with India's ONGC that they may join forces in Rosneft's yet to be built liquefied natural gas plant in the far east of Russia to the benefit of Indian consumers. Now, before we go on, note here what has happened. That plant, in order to have a short pipeline of gas to India, would perforce have to go through China. Okay, so notice the Russian moves are geopolitically staking out the pipeline route. The other possible pipeline would be through the Central Asian republics, but those republics, recall, are quite under the thumb of Washington, D.C. So, in other words, if this deal is to come through, there will also be pipeline deals, trilateral agreements between Russia and China and India. And there will probably be shipping agreements and so on. And eventually, I think you're going to see this extended to, guess who? Japan. Okay, and that's going to be another huge geopolitical blow for the Anglo American power elite. Now, listen to this next statement in Zero Hedge. We have just one question about this arrangement. Will payment for crude and liquid natural gas be made in rubles or rupees or in gold? Because it certainly won't be made in dollars. And folks, that's true. And if, pardon me, if the Russians are able to cinch these deals, particularly with India, then rest assured, without any hesitation, I can say this in absolute confidence, rest assured that within a matter of maybe just a few years, perhaps even a few months, you will begin to see those three countries take definite and distinctive, dramatic steps toward the establishment of international clearing of their own, independent of SWIFT and CHIPS, and independent of the Western backed banks like the World Monetary Fund and IMF and BIS and all of that other nonsense in Switzerland. You will see these countries move very quickly to establish their own international clearing. This means, as I've said, that there will be a renewed and concentrated space effort to secure the hardware in space that makes that clearing possible. So watch what happens very carefully, folks. The game just got much, much more interesting, largely due to the ineptitude of that crazy neocon element in Washington, D.C., that acts as nothing but a proxy for a certain country that wants very dearly to see America fulfill its own geopolitical wishes and whims in the Middle East. All right. That's it for news and views from the Nefarium. I'll see you on the flip side, and God bless everybody.